At Blair County Conservation District for having me. I am excited to be here today to talk to you all about caring for your buffer. I just need host capabilities. I'll share my screen and we will get rolling. Awesome. All right. Yep. Okay, 1 second. Oh, well, we'll make it work like this. I always wish I could see you all a little bit better while I was presenting, but I can never quite seem to figure that out. That's okay. All right, here we go. So again, we're going to talk about caring for your buffer today. I hope you all have enjoyed the entire webinar series. We talked about sort of, from the very beginning, what is a buffer, to designing the buffer, other streamside concerns. Now, caring for your buffer is going to be about buffer maintenance, or making sure your buffer after it's planted survives and thrives. So why maintenance? Why are we doing that? Like, we don't maintain trees in the wild, really. They grow fine. So why do we need to do this? We didn't always maintain buffers. What changed? How did we get here? Well, we've learned from our past mistakes. When we first started planting buffers a couple decades ago as a best management practice for water quality, those buffers were planted in more of a random design. There was not a lot of maintenance recommended. And honestly, a lot of those buffers didn't make it. We had a lot of early failures, which led to a lot of people having an unfavorable opinion of forest buffers, which is unfortunate because you can have a lot of success if done the right way. Happily, a lot of really interested people didn't take these failures as defeat. They sat down and they knew that trees weren't going to be so important to streams. So they studied and tried to figure out ways to make this work. And now in 2022 and beyond, we have a lot of great strategies that work really well for ensuring your buffer is able to survive and thrive. We learned a lot from nursery and orchard culture about having clean culture. We'll talk about that later on. And we also are maintaining buffers because we need to make sure that our new investments in buffers do better than they did before. So we're spending funding on this. We are working to get these in place so we can clean up streams and rivers in Pennsylvania, so everyone in Pennsylvania has access to clean water. And so we need to make sure those investments are well worthwhile. So we are maintaining our buffers as best as we can. I'm sure, like we talked about, early buffers, everyone has seen them. They did not have a lot of success. It's super unfortunate. I'm sure you've all seen what was supposed to be a forest buffer, and it was planted, and now it looks like this, which is not a forest. I don't even know if you can see, there is a tiny little tree tube here, basically hidden in all the weeds, and the sad stream is just being choked by the weeds. Or you've seen this, where there's just a field of empty tree tubes and they're all kind of bent over and there's no trees coming out of them and people don't know what they're even for. Why is all that plastic in the field? So we really want to avoid these situations. These situations occur for a lot of reasons, but two of the big reasons are what we like to call the green death or the brown death. So the green death is weeds, and primarily a specific weed we have called reed canary grass, which is totally fine and normal in Pennsylvania if we're not trying to grow other things there. So it's just a very aggressive weed. It forms really thick, dense mats, and it outcompetes any other vegetation, including trees. So if your buffer is planted here in this, and these weeds are not controlled around the trees, those trees won't have a chance, and this green death will starve your trees of all the nutrients they need to grow, and you will not have a success. The brown death, of course, are voles, meadow voles, and they are such a problem in buffers because they will just eat the trees right off at the base. That's one of their favorite things. This is what it looks like. The voles will get in there. They like getting inside tree shelters. They just chew the roots and the bottom of the trees off. And then, of course, these trees have no access to water or nutrients in the soil, and they're not going to survive. So these are some of the biggest things we're trying to combat with caring for your buffer, is making sure you don't have weed problems or vole problems. So we talked a lot about design last week, so I'm not going to dwell on that this week, but you really want to make sure when you are designing your buffer, you are designing it for maintenance. You want to plant in straight rows instead of a random scattered planting, so you can easily get between those rows to mow and spray, which we'll talk about. You definitely want to use tree tubes to protect trees from that spray you're using to maintain, as well as to protect trees from deer, which is sort of the other brown death that these trees can succumb to. You want to space your rows of trees according to the mower size you have to accommodate that mower. And you want to keep in mind that maintenance begins with site prep. So you want to have that site ready to plant. You want to have it mowed down. You want to have spots sprayed ahead of time so you can plant those trees into a weed-free environment. You want to shelter those trees, get it set up for success from the beginning. So we have learned a lot. You saw those failure pictures. Well, here is a time lapse of a buffer that was planted by Stroud Water Research Center, and they're in Southeast Pennsylvania. So here it is shortly after planting. You can see the contractor sort of down here, still working on some of the planting, installing some of the tree tubes. This is a couple years later. You can see how it's being maintained pretty well. You can start to see a couple of the little trees popping out of the tubes here. And then here it is after it has grown up and matured. I think this is about 10 years old. I should have put that info on the slide, would have been helpful, but you can see it's much more successful than those slides we had earlier that were just a mess, that had dead trees sticking out of them everywhere, or just were choked out by weeds entirely, or old tubes falling over. So this is what we're going for. This is a successful buffer, and this is the kind of success you can have if you maintain that buffer the right way and care for your buffer the right way. So how do we care for buffers? You got to set yourself up for success with proper planting and smart design first. And we talked about that last week. I mentioned it just a little bit ago, but it is so important to make your buffer successful and to make your life easier as the landowner or as the person doing sort of the planting or the management of the project, to set that buffer up for success first. That is the beginning to caring for your buffer. Then, of course, we have mowing, herbicide and weed control, shelter maintenance, replanting. We'll talk about each of those things in following slides, but every single buffer needs care. Care might differ buffer to buffer. Maybe in some areas you don't need to mow as much. Maybe you're not putting herbicide on that site because the landowner doesn't want it. Either way, every buffer needs specific care. So developing a plan, who's going to care for that buffer? When are they going to go out to the buffer to do certain activities? What does that look like? Who's responsible? What's the budget? All of those things should be kind of thought about in advance. So forever, are we maintaining these always, forever, every year? No, not forever. We are just maintaining the first few years after planting. The first 3 years are the most critical. Sometimes up to 5 years are very critical in areas with high invasive plant pressure. But generally, once the trees are out of their shelters and it's reaching canopy closure, kind of what you see in this photo here, you can stop doing those heavy maintenance activities. You can stop spraying, you can stop mowing, and just let your riparian forest be a forest. But does need help to get to that point. We're planting these buffers in sort of what some people call like a hostile environment. There are so many invasive plants in Pennsylvania now. These areas haven't been a forest previously. There's a lot of seed in the soil that is undesirable, not stuff we want there. So we really need to give these buffers a running start to help them be successful. All right, mowing. So when you're mowing your buffer, again, you're designing that buffer in the beginning, planting it so you have adequate space to get between the rows on a mower, just like this guy is doing here. You want to mow 2 to 3 times a year during the growing season. You might need to mow more than that, but you want to shoot for at least 2 to 3 times. Mowing is generally not an alternative to broad spectrum herbicide use around the shelters, but it's a really effective companion. What mowing does is it stops weeds from growing up in between the rows of trees and then setting seed closer to the trees themselves. So it helps you stay ahead of invasive species, but we still really need to maintain those weeds really close to the shelters to give those trees a competitive advantage. Again, we want to design our buffer so we can fit the mower in between. Do be aware that if your buffer is planted through the CREP Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program that's run through USDA, Farm Service Agency, and NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, mowing is only allowed for the first 2 to 3 years, depending on your contract. So do check that and make sure you're not going to be in breach of your contract. For non-CREP buffers, we like to see mowing done up to 5 years, longer if needed, totally site dependent, but we do want to mow on all of our buffers in between the rows of trees 2 to 3 times a year, as long as we can. Herbicide. Herbicide is going to be the most critical. I will talk about options if you don't have a property where herbicide can be applied, but let's not talk, we'll focus on the herbicide first. Generally, you want to spray either spots around trees, as shown in this photo where they have sort of little spots sprayed around each of the tree tubes, or you want to spray rows, just go right down that row of trees here and kind of kill all of the invasive or competitive plants that are growing around the trees. We know that herbicide is a really controversial topic. We know that some people don't like it. We know that it's being overused in our society as a whole. However, there are reasons that make it very worthwhile in a buffer. We need these buffers to grow to protect the environment. We are not spraying herbicide in buffers just because we want nice green grass, like for our lawns. We're not doing it for any of that. We're doing it so we can assure that in a couple of years, we have a healthy forest that is protecting our stream and protecting our water quality. So it's sort of a trade-off. It's the best way to help a buffer survive and thrive and grow big fast. And so we're trading off that couple of years of herbicide applications and careful controlled methods so that we can have a successful buffer long-term. Generally, we want to use a broad spectrum glyphosate herbicide. One example that is recommended is Roundup Pro because it is sort of water friendly. You don't have to use Roundup in particular. There are other options out there. I'll recommend a resource later that talks about how to choose an herbicide, but Roundup Pro is one of the recommendations for which herbicide to use. How are you going to apply this herbicide? Some people say 3-foot circles, some people say 6-foot circles, but you're just going to kind of take your herbicide sprayer and spray a ring around that tree to give it lots of room to grow. This is a 3-foot circle. This is more like a 6-foot circle here. So all those weeds are back away from the tree so that tree can get all of the resources in the soil where its roots are spreading out, all of the nutrients, all of the water, everything it needs to really grow well. How are you going to apply that herbicide? Well, you can use the handheld sprayers. This individual here is applying herbicide with a backpack sprayer. It's pretty convenient. You can just walk along. Some people also use ATVs. You can ride the ATV and spray around the tree or spray strips with the ATV. There are even ATV sprayers you can use for that initial site prep, but that's basically how you apply herbicide. I do want to say you want to follow all the precautions on the herbicide label. You want to know what you're doing. You want to handle this safely. We don't take this lightly. So make sure that you are well educated about spraying herbicide. Penn State has some great courses to educate you on that if you need to. People often question, do you need to be a certified herbicide sprayer? If you are spraying on your own property, you do not. If you are spraying on other people's property, then yes, you need to get your herbicide certification. And that's available through courses at Penn State and then through the Department of Agriculture in Pennsylvania. So this is what sort of some 4-year-old trees can look like with mowing in between the rows here and then spraying herbicide strips where the trees are growing. These trees are already big. They're pretty beautiful. You're not going to maintain this for much longer. It does really well. And this is what clean culture looks like. This was taken again from nursery and orchard settings. How they get their trees to grow so successfully is by using this approach. And then we learned how to make our buffers successful from that same approach that they have used over the years. If you are working on an organic farm or with a landowner that really does not want to use herbicide, there are alternatives. They don't work as well as herbicide. We do recommend herbicide whenever you are able to use it on a property, but if you cannot, there are weed mats. These are some photos of weed mats. Here's a weed mat right after planting. They can be plastic or like landscaping fabric. They're usually black. Here is one that is sort of on a buffer that's been growing for a couple of years. You can see some of the people mowing in between, some of the old stuff getting on top. They don't work in every setting. Sometimes the weed pressure can be so high, they'll push up the weed mats and it won't really help kill and combat them, but they can work. They are held in place by 4 metal landscape staples. The downside to these is really that they have to be removed eventually, or they're going to cause, just like litter out in the natural setting, and we don't want that. We don't want more garbage plastic kind of blowing around. So these will need to be taken off of the trees once those trees get big. All 4 staples plus the plastic or the landscape fabric removed. They also have cost. So when you are budgeting for your buffer, you want to make sure you take that into consideration as well. Another alternative is stone mulch. People use 2A modified stone mulch, which is mixed sizes. They apply it in a 2-inch deep, 12-inch diameter around each tree tube. You can see this has been planted with stone mulch here. This is what that looks like. That will at least help the weeds not grow so much right around the trees. Stroudwater Research Center has been doing some studies on this recently. It does seem to be working. Downsides are that stone is heavy and hard to haul. So if you're planting a very large buffer, it can be very, very labor intensive to apply stone mulch. If you're having a contractor do it, that can cost a lot more money, but it is a good alternative out there for properties on which herbicide cannot be utilized. All right, so why do we push herbicide so hard? Here is a chart from a study done by Stroudwater Research Center. I talk about them a lot, but they're one of sort of the leading groups that is doing a lot of studies on buffer maintenance. They show here, this is tree survivorship percentage on this side, and this is growth in centimeters. So you can see this is a control with nothing done. Next is mowing only. This is a weed mat only, so it has an advantage over just mowing. And then you can see herbicide and how many more trees survived and how much taller those trees grew when they had those herbicide rings. So that's why we do recommend it. Again, alternatives are promising. Stone mulch is looking promising. Tree mats are a good option if we don't have anything else, but if you can use herbicide, please do. Okay, enough about herbicide spots. Another thing we want to maintain with trees are the shelters. So we want to choose a shelter for around our trees. Most commonly, we see tree tubes. There are two major brands of tree tubes. I'm sure there are others out there, but those are Plantra. Those are the greenish, or this is a Plantra tube here, I'm sorry, in this photo. It's white, it has a fiberglass stake. And then there's the Tubex tubes. Those are like a light green and have an oak stake usually. These tubes are so important for many reasons. They protect trees from deer browse. Usually we want to use a 4 or 5 foot tube. 5-foot tubes seem to be a little bit better for protecting the trees from deer. It's a little higher than they can reach. It also protects bigger trees from buck rub, so the bucks don't rub their antlers on those trees and rub the bark off of them so the trees die. It also allows us to spray herbicide around the trees without damaging the trees, and that's really critical. So there's a lot of debate about tree tubes in buffers, but studies show that tree tubes do give buffers the best chance of survival. Studies at Stroud, there's also been studies done by Virginia Department of Forestry that show the same thing. If you are working with a landowner or yourself, you're very opposed to tree tubes, there are other methods like wire cages, different things. Please feel free to reach out if you have questions about those. But in general, tree tubes are sort of the best, easiest bet for the ease of maintenance down the road. So what are you going to do with tree shelters and their maintenance? You want to make sure that you're doing a couple different things. So first, this photo here, this shows a bird net on the tree tube. And we want to have a bird net on the tree tube because that helps birds not go down that tube and die. Bluebirds have specifically been known to be going down tree tubes during nesting season looking for a good place to nest, and then they can't get back out. So we put these bird nets on there like this. This is called the center hole method. It leaves a little hole for the tree to come out, but this hole is not big enough for birds to go down. They'll avoid it. So this really seems to work well. We want this hole in the middle to be about the size of like a silver dollar or so, bigger than a quarter, but not too big. So every year you want to go out when your tree starts coming out of the tube like this one, you're going to want to remove that bird net so the tree can come up out of the tube and not get tangled. When they get tangled in the bird net, sometimes it can cause what I've heard some people refer to as whirly top. The tree just gets all tangled and unhealthy, and it's never quite right. So it's really important to get those bird nets off as our trees start to emerge from the shelters. Here you can see, this is Ryan Davis from the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay. He has just a little like X-Acto knife, box cutter thing, and he's cutting the bird net off of that tree shelter. You will also want to straighten tree shelters after flooding and storms. You might need to replace some stakes, you might even need to replace shelters, but floods can really push trees down easily. You can help alleviate that by putting the stake in sort of upstream so that when it's not like dragging the tree down when it floods, it helps a little bit. But every time after it floods, there's a big storm, you're going to want to go out, straighten any bent over like these tree tubes, repound that stake in the ground, replace what needs replaced. That's how you maintain your shelters. You also do need to remove shelters. Now, as you can see here, shelters are designed, they're usually perforated on one side so that when the trees get big enough, they pop them open. But what we see more often than not is these shelters don't pop off the tree properly and ends up damaging the tree. So when your tree starts to get about this big, a couple inches in diameter, people usually say about as around like as a wrist. So if you look in your tree is about as around as your wrist in that tree tube, you want to take just again one of those box cutter X-Acto knife things, slice it right along the perforation, careful not to slice the tree, and remove those tree tubes. At this point, the trees are big enough to withstand any buck rub and should be good to go. Then to care for your buffer, every year you're also going to want to replant. Hopefully you have great survival, but a lot of programs do require a 70% survival. As you saw, when you have herbicide, you have shelters, you do have a really good survival rate, so you might not need to do much replanting. But if you do have a lot of die-off, you're going to want to get new tree seedlings and replant those either in the spring or in the fall to help your buffer survive and thrive. You want to have a buffer that reaches canopy closure, meaning the tree canopies are all kind of closed and you're getting a fully shaded area around that stream that you're trying to protect eventually. So if you do all of this, if you mow and you spray, you take care of those weeds, you take care of your tree shelters, you remove them when you can have a really successful buffer. Here's a photo again from Stroud. This is the mid-1990s is when this photo was taken here before the buffer was planted. So just note this crooked tree. You're going to use it as reference in the next photo. This is a buffer, the same spot. This is the crooked tree back here. This is 20 years later. And you can see how these trees are large and beautiful. They have a nice canopy. It's protecting this little stream right here. It's doing its job. And this was done with shelters, tree shelters, and herbicide spots. And that's how they had this success. So you don't have that mess in the beginning of a field of weeds with empty tree shelters. You have a big, beautiful forest instead. What does this look like on the calendar? How often, when are you doing these activities? Here's an example. Things could shift a little bit month by month, but this is kind of how it looks. So right now, late February, early March, you want to go out there for the first check of the year, fix up any tubes and stakes that got pushed over in the winter. In April, you're going to want to start spraying. That's when you're going to do your 3-foot diameter herbicide spots up to 6-foot diameter if you want to go that large. If you do use mats or stone mulch, you can just kind of like browse those, look, hand pull any weeds that might be coming up, make sure they're doing their job. And then you want to pull off the nets for trees that are within 12 inches of the top of the shelter. Usually once that tree gets within a foot of the top of the tree shelter, birds can kind of land on top of the tree and get back out of the shelter. So any tree that looks like it's within a foot, pull those nets on off. In May, you're going to do your first mow between the rows. Then in midsummer, July, August, you're going to mow first. Then you're going to kind of lift up tubes, pull any weeds or vines that are growing inside those tubes. Do your second application of herbicide if you need to, if you notice those spots are starting to grow back with a lot of competing vegetation. And then you're going to remove any dead trees and mark those for replanting. Then in October, you can do your final mowing for the season, replant as needed, and do your net and shelter checks as needed, pulling those off the trees that grew big over the summer and now need those bird nets removed. So that's what it looks like in the first few years. Then once you get out to year 5, that's when you're going to be removing those tree shelters, hopefully, because your trees are big and strong, and you can kind of let your buffer do its thing as a buffer. Many, many thanks to David Wise at Stroud Water Research Center and Art Gover with Penn State Wildland Weed Management. He recently retired, but he was with them for many years. A lot of this information that I know has come directly from them and presentations they have shared over the years. You'll probably have seen a lot of the photos in my slides were cited. They're their photos, it's their information. They are the ones that have done this research, and I would not know any of this without them and many of their colleagues as well. Some additional resources for maintaining your buffer. Penn State Extension just did within the past few years a great video series called Growing Great Buffers. This is the link here. There's a lot of videos that focus on each of these individual aspects of maintenance that I just talked about that show you kind of what that looks like and how it takes place. So do go check those out. They're excellent resources. Stroud has a page for their watershed restoration program that has a lot of their publications and studies done. If you want to see that science, what's it look like? What did the studies show? You can go see all of that there on Stroud's website. Penn State Wildland Weed Management also has a lot of publications. This is where you'll find how to select your herbicide that I mentioned there. There's a publication on that, as well as a lot of other really wonderful information about managing weeds in wild spaces. And then there is something called the Landowner Guide to Buffer Success. There's both an older version done by the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, as well as a new version done by the Pennsylvania Association of Conservation Districts. There are the links to both of those. It's not really a calendar, but it's set up like a calendar that shows you these buffer maintenance activities and gives you instruction on how to do them, plus more info that you can follow sort of month by month. It's a very wonderful resource to anyone planting or dealing with buffers. And that is all. So I will take any questions that anyone might have about caring for your buffer. I'll stop sharing my screen so we can do that. All right. Does anyone have questions?
Teddy, it looks like a question came in. It says, in regards to the early maintenance, what about the herbaceous layer areas that are planted for a specific reason, say for pollinator-friendly areas under the trees? Would those species be planted after the 5-year mark?
You can, that's a great question. Thanks for asking. You can plant those when you plant your buffer, but you're still going to want to do the herbicide spots. So people say, if you can only do one thing, if you can't mow, which would be in that case, you're not going to be mowing because you have those intentionally planted pollinator crops. The best thing you can do is the herbicide spots. So let those pollinator plants grow away from the trees, but in that 3-foot area, at least right around the tree, you're still going to want to spray there. So those pollinator species aren't sort of taking the nutrients away from the trees. But then I wouldn't worry about mowing in that situation. If you're going to kill all the competing vegetation and plant those intentionally, then you really wouldn't mow, but you do still want to do the herbicide rings. Does that make sense? I hope so. Perfect. Other questions? If anyone does have questions sort of down the road, you are always welcome to reach out. I'm more than happy to help with any questions that come up, whether that's about caring for your buffer, design, about buffers generally, or anything else you might need to know that I might be able to help with. So my contact information was on that last slide, my email and my phone number. So please feel free to reach out anytime with anything about your buffer. I will try to get back to you as quickly as possible. And thanks so much for tuning into all of these webinars.
Yes, thank you, everybody. And thank you, Teddy, for joining us and helping us present these webinars to our community here in Blair County. We greatly appreciate it. Again, if anybody missed any previous webinars or would like to rewatch them, they will be or are uploaded on the Blair County Conservation District's YouTube channel. So thank you all again for tuning in. Thank you, Teddy. And I hope everybody enjoys the rest of your day. And hopefully maybe this spring you'll plant some riparian buffers.
Happy planting.
Again, before you leave, if you could please complete the survey within the chat, that would be greatly appreciated. So thank you all and have a